Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new Getting to Know Japan webinar. Thank you for joining us. I'm Jeff Mazziata, the Activities Coordinator here at YCAPS, along with Isaac Nordenberg, our Research Programs intern, who's supporting me on the technical side of things today. I'm stepping in today for our usual host and Program Director of the series, Amani Kit, who's currently preparing to give birth to her child. Amani, we wish you the best and look forward to having you back soon. So today we are joined by Dr. Kyle Cleveland, who will be presenting on nuclear Japan. A little bit about Dr. Cleveland. He's the Associate Professor of Sociology at Temple University's Japan campus and the founding director of TUJ's Institute of Contemporary Asian Studies, through which he has organized a series of public lectures, workshops, and symposia on Japan's 311 Tohoku earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear disasters. He's the co-editor with Scott Knowles and Ryuma Shineha of Legacies of Fukushima 311 in Context. And also, he's been very helpful with us in organizing some in-person Fukushima Daiichi tours. So yeah, we're very happy to have Dr. Cleveland with us today. One final note, I'd just like to give everyone a kind reminder to refrain from turning on your microphones during the duration of today's recording and presentation. That being said, I'd like to pass it over to Dr. Cleveland. So Dr. Cleveland, please go ahead.
With our Institute of Contemporary. About 20 years ago, I founded this institute. We do about 30 or 40 events a year. And John's organization, YCAPS, I think their first two full-time employees were TUJ students. And so it's nice to have this collaboration. What I'm going to talk through today, I think the title in some ways is way too inclusive and misleading. I mean, talk about your reach exceeding your grasp. To have 30 minutes to talk about the history of nuclear in Japan is impossible. It'd be a graduate program. My own particular expertise on these starts back in 2011. I wasn't a nuclear expert, and I should say from the very beginning that I'm not a nuclear expert. And I think there's a real difference between people who are technically trained and people who are, kind of, I guess you might call them, I consider myself to be something of a dilettante in this. But I have devoted considerable time to this. I teach a course now on disaster studies. And I've published about a half a dozen articles, probably been to 15 or more conferences. Through our institute, I've organized about 25 lectures on nuclear issues. My wife is from Koriyama City, which is the largest city adjacent to the nuclear power plant, Fukushima. And I've been up there on many research trips. So I was just up there about a week ago doing research inside the nuclear zone. So as was mentioned, I'm the co-editor of this book that has 19 authors. It came out on the 10-year anniversary of the nuclear crisis. In addition to that, I wrote this article, kind of works both ends against the middle about whether or not it was as bad as people think it was, or was it in fact maybe worse. And if we're going to start talking about the history of nuclear in Japan, obviously, if we don't go back to Trinity and try to relitigate the moral turpitude of Robert Oppenheimer, I think we have to start at Hiroshima. I've always been more or less pro-nuclear. My father was a scientist. He was a science and biology teacher. I also should say that he was in the Navy in the Korean War on an aircraft carrier. He was a rescue swimmer on an aircraft carrier. And so I'm sympathetic, I guess, realist in the sense of the need for security in any nation. Max Weber said a security is defined by its ability to exert violence on behalf of its citizens. And I think inevitably when we talk about nuclear in Japan, we have to talk about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And having been more or less pro-nuclear throughout my life, I must say that when I first visited Hiroshima, it really pushed me back. It really made me rethink things. I had a feeling like this is a power beyond our control. In 2018 and also last year, I did interviews with Hibakusha, survivors of the atomic bomb, over the course of a couple of days. And the stories they told were beyond imagining. One of them said that Her father was a Buddhist priest, and a lot of the temples were along the mountain line of Hiroshima where the blast ran up to, and they used them as temporary hospitals and shelters. She said that in 1 week he did 700 cremations. There were pits that were dug, for the bodies. Children weren't allowed to see those. One of Baksha said that for 14 years she had many surgeries, and her parents in her home took away every reflective surface, every mirror, every piece of glass. She said even in Hiroshima, people would get up on the train and walk away from her. And one of the just darkest things I've ever heard is that if you go south of Hiroshima, at Fukushima Shrine, which is, this major cultural heritage site, for many years after the bombings or the attack on Hiroshima, and I should say it was an attack upon a civilian civilization. It's always interesting how we use the passive construction of a bombing as though it happened without human consent. But the Hibakusha were not allowed to enter the mine for almost 2 decades after the bombing, because under a Japanese notion of kagare, or ritual pollution that goes back to Shinto religion, they were considered to be contaminated. I've organized quite a number of events, and I've really tried to work both ends against the middle. I've done both pro and anti-nuclear and things that couldn't be categorized in that dichotomy. And just this last year, there's a very interesting lecture by Ron Zwigenberg at Penn State University. Ron is a historian of the Holocaust, but also an expert on Hiroshima. And he's just written this book, which talks about the development of post-traumatic stress disorder starting to emerge after World War II, where they didn't really have a frame of reference for that. And apparently the cohort of atomic bomb survivors were an important cohort for that. He has a very interesting essay that I was going through, this talking about the Atoms for Peace exhibit in Hiroshima. This was basically a public propaganda campaign to try to promote commercial nuclear energy and to move the emphasis away from weapons of war. And you're probably familiar with Dwight Eisenhower's famous talk on that and the development of that idea. I'm going to play just about 3 minutes of that here.
An acceptable solution to the armaments race, which overshadows not only the peace, but the very life of the world. We shall carry into these private or diplomatic talks a new conception. The United States would seek more than the mere reduction or elimination of atomic materials for military purposes. It is not enough to take this weapon out of the hands of the soldiers. It must be put into the hands of those who will know how to strip its military casing and adapt it to the arts of peace. The United States knows that if the fearful trend of atomic military buildup can be reversed, this greatest of destructive forces can be developed into a great boon for the benefit of all mankind. The United States knows that peaceful power from atomic energy is no dream of the future. That capability, already proved, is here, now, today. Who can doubt if the entire body of the world's scientists and engineers had adequate amounts of fissionable material with which to test and develop their ideas, that this capability would rapidly be transformed into universal, efficient, and economic usage? To hate we would expect that such an agency would be set up under the aegis of the United Nations. The ratios of contributions, the procedures, and other details would properly be within the scope of the private conversations I have referred to earlier. The United States is prepared to undertake these explorations in good faith. Any partner of the United States acting in the same good faith will find the United States a not unreasonable or ungenerous associate. Undoubtedly, initial and early contributions to this plan would be small in quantity. However, the proposal has the great virtue
that it can be undertaken without the special, safe conditions under which such a bank of fissionable material can be made essentially
immune to surprise seizure. The more important responsibility of this atomic energy agency would be to devise methods whereby this fissionable material would be allocated to serve the peaceful pursuits of mankind. Experts would be mobilized to apply atomic energy to the needs of agriculture, medicine, and other peaceful activities. A special purpose would be to provide abundant electrical energy in the power-starved areas of the world. Thus, the contributing powers would be dedicating some of their strength to serve the needs rather than the fears of mankind. The United States would be more than willing, if appropriate. Second, begin to diminish the potential destructive power of the world's atomic stockpiles. Third, allow all peoples of all nations to see that in this enlightened age, the great powers of the earth, both of the East and of the West, are interested in human aspirations first.
It's worth listening in its totality. You know, as I was watching this and ruminating on this today, I just thought, remember the day when we had presidents of gravitas and dignity and honor and accomplishment like Dwight Eisenhower. Makes you nostalgic for such a day. So the Atoms for Peace program was promoted around the world, but it also took hold in Japan. And it was especially important in Japan because Japan had just experienced the ravages of war. It's odd in a way that it was able to gain traction. And let's see if I can get the right one here. It's odd that it was able to gain traction given what had just happened with the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This was not that long. This was less than a decade after the fact. Remarkably, Ron Ziegenberg, writing about this, says that there was an exhibit at the Hiroshima Institute in Hiroshima promoting Atoms for Peace. It became very quickly jumbled with the Lucky Dragon incident, where in the Castle Bravo test, where they first tested the hydrogen bomb, had a bomb that ran away from a 6 megaton yield from 6 to 15, overwhelmed the military that were around to watch it and monitor it, and also by a great, feat of irony, washed over the top of the Lucky Dragon ship, and yet you had another Hibakusha incident. So soon after that, people, particularly in Hiroshima, very much turned against it. There was even discussion of opening a nuclear reactor in Hiroshima. If anyone's read the work of John Dower, he wrote the Pulitzer Prize-winning book called Embracing Defeat. He talks about the very peculiar post-war dynamic where Japan more or less embraced the American occupation. MacArthur was considered to be something of a demigod. And that is a very peculiar arrangement that's probably unprecedented in the history of war. So the Atoms of Peace movement was also was employed in the siting of nuclear reactors around Japan. If you look up into the history of Fukushima and Tohoku, where those nuclear power plants were sited, people at the time didn't know much about nuclear energy, but they were being told that it was a great boon to these communities. If anyone's been up to Tohoku, it's largely agricultural and fishing communities. There's no real major industries up there. And so these atomic reactors became very much a cash cow for these local communities. In some cases, the plant itself and the tertiary industries that it supported it employed most of the people in the region that weren't working in agriculture. And people very much bought into this. I've done interviews in 3 different occasions, in 2016, 2018, and last week, with mayors of the evacuated towns. Altogether, there were 9 towns evacuated from the radiation exposure coming out of the Fukushima nuclear power plant. And I've gone back 3 times now to talk with, for the most part, the same city office, but in some cases, mayors have been moved out of office and new people have come in. And without exception, they had all been very supportive of nuclear energy. They bought this rhetoric completely, and also there's great financial incentive for them to go along with this until after the nuclear accident. And now people have really bitterly turned against that. You know, Godzilla is a reference to the radiation coming out of Hiroshima. Believe it or not, the best film that's been made about the Fukushima nuclear disaster is Shin Godzilla. There have been a few others, one called The Days, one called the Fukushima 50. I hear that Ridley Scott has a movie in production, but probably Shin Godzilla, because it's the understory, the subtext is really about that, is the best movie that has been made to date about Fukushima. Now, I got to say, I can't give in 20 some minutes from here a granular history of nuclear energy in Japan. And I have to speak to what I think I know or what I know. At our art university, at our art school in Philadelphia, the Tyler School of Art at Temple, which is really quite elite, they ask incoming students 3 questions. How is your work different from anyone else? Why should you be the person to do that? And can you finish? And with that in mind, I mean, I think I have something of a unique position in this, in that I was involved in it at a couple of different levels. It was very personal to me because my wife is from Fukushima, from Koriyama City. I was also the study abroad advisor at my university for about 25 years. And at the time of the nuclear disaster, you know, about half of our students are American students. And we were getting calls from third-party study abroad advisors, from parents, were freaking out about this, trying to figure out what was going on. And no one really had very many answers to this. The kind of messaging we were getting in the media was very contradictory. Japan was basically saying nothing to see here. There's been an accident, but it's not that bad. Then the next day, the building number 1 reactor blew out, and the government was saying, well, it wasn't the pressurized radiation vessel. It was just the outer building, so it's not that bad. By the time they got to the 3rd building, they were saying that the radiation readings were 1 million times beyond background, which had to be an accident because they thought it was an instrument error. But it was pretty clear that by about 4 or 5 days into the incident, it was really dramatic. To give you a sense of that, I'm going to play a short clip here of a conversation that was taking place between the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the Pentagon, the Situation Room in the White House, and the U.S. military at the Blue Ridge, you know, the 7th Fleet, and also the U.S. ambassador. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission has a Fukushima reading room that has all of these documents starting from March 15th, the date for about a month, 300 pages a day of transcribed telephone calls. This is one of the telephone calls coming through these U.S. nuclear officials. And you get a real sense of the way they were processing at the time.
Okay. Talk about the time for the concrete, you know, to disassociate.
You know, that new rig says it's a couple inches an hour. You know, and of course that Mark 1 containment is the worst one of all the containments we have. And it's, you know, it's literally, you know, the new rig tells you that in a station blackout, you're going to lose containment.
A couple of things of note here. The person speaking is Charles Casto. I've come to know Chuck very well. I've probably talked to Chuck 30 or 40 times. I've visited him at his home in Georgia. We traveled up into the nuclear evacuation zone for an entire week. He has a book called Total Station Blackout. There's a chapter that writes about that. Chuck was the lead representative for the U.S. government industry. He was on site for 11 months. He still does consultation with TEPCO. He was a 38-year career veteran of the NRC. He was a regional director over 7 states. And he had worked the Browns Ferry site in Alabama that had an accident in a Mark I design reactor, which made him, you know, a bit of an expert. He also taught at their school. And what he's saying here is that in the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's own documents, if they have a total station blackout, they're going to lose containment. What that means is radiation is going to go out in massive amounts into the air. And, you know, it's funny, he can't quite get people's attention because it's a little bit technical, but he's saying, we're going to lose this plant.
You know, There's no doubt about it. They are looking for insight, guidance, recommendations from the NRC for all 4 spent fuel pools for the Daiichi.
This guy can't say Daiichi.
I'm sorry, Unit 4. The explosion leveled the walls, leveled the structure for the Unit 4 spent fuel pool all the way down to the approximate level of the bottom of the fuel, so there's no water in there whatsoever. This is going to progress to the point at which we probably have, I think, have to assume at this point that we're going to have 3 reactors out of control and possibly up to 6 spent fuel pools. Agreed. I think we need to take whatever actions are necessary to deal with that. Chairman, this is Admiral Donald at Naval Reactors. I agree with you. For your background, other countries, I think right now what we're talking about is the status of U.S. personnel in Japan, not necessarily, evacuations outside of around the facility, etc. If we still believe that 50 miles is the appropriate distance, then we can also have that as a message. But I think there's broader U.S. personnel issues that need to be addressed. Yeah, Chairman, this is Bill Borges. If this happened in the U.S., we'd go out to 50 miles. That would be.
Okay, so for me, this was extremely motivating because my wife's family lives in Koriyama. Koriyama sits at 55 kilometers away from the Daiichi plant. Japan set their evacuation zone at 30 kilometers. The United States Department of Energy and the NRC recommended an 80-kilometer distance. So there's quite a bit of a difference between that. And the difference on this was that with the Japanese government had based their analysis on a pre-existing protocol that had been written by the International Atomic Energy Commission based upon the power rating of a reactor, not upon any actual radiation readings. The United States recommendation was actually based upon real radiation assessment that started happening within a couple of days of this. So for this military or military adjacent audience, I think one of the really interesting things here is that in the first couple of weeks of this disaster, the United States military and the United States government knew much more nuanced detail about what was happening with this accident than the Japanese did. I could tell story after story. I've done almost 400 interviews on this research, and I've interviewed quite a lot of people in the upper ranks of the State Department and also the U.S. Navy, all the branches of the military. And I won't quote the withering statements that they made, but really the sense was that the Japanese government, the Japanese military did not have nuclear expertise. I interviewed General Oreki, who was the head of the Jeitai Ground Self-Defense Forces. And in more measured terms, I related to him that notion. And he said, I think you understand the situation very well. We relied on the Americans. We did not have nuclear expertise. And that's because they don't have nuclear weapons. Well, you would think you would have nuclear expertise related to the reactors and commercial nuclear energy. But the problem is what happens in nuclear accidents, and this has been the case in 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, Fukushima, is that the utility that runs the reactors are only really responsible for the reactors. Once you have a radiological release, that passes over into the local communities. It passes on, in the United States, it goes to the Department of Health, to the Environmental Protection Agency, it goes to the governor, to town officials. But once the plume is out of the plant, it's no longer their responsibility. And so as a result, there was very little coordination in this accident between the nuclear utility and others. So last week when I was in Fukushima, I was interviewing people within the city of Namie. Namie, at its closest point, is about 4 kilometers away from the reactors. It's right here in the upper middle. You can barely see it there in the mountains. And then it runs out to about 20 kilometers. From a ridge on those mountains, you can see the Daiichi plant quite clearly. The mayor of Namie did not find out about this accident until he watched it on TV a couple of days later. I interviewed that mayor, and he was absolutely outraged about this. Eventually, Mayor Baba brought a $1 billion lawsuit against TEPCO that's now continuing to be. TEPCO has not resolved or agreed to any settlement on this. This is Bob at the beginning of the disaster. I interviewed Baba 5 times. This is Bob in his office a couple of years later. I don't have time to read this, but he says we got nothing from the government. We got no assistance whatsoever. He felt that they were being chased by a Gimpatsu monster, kind of reminded me of Godzilla. And he said we were like bees that had fled from a hive. I was very moved this last week when we were in the city offices of Namie, and we were talking to the staff there. And one of the women there said that she was evacuated on the 13th of March and thought she took a change of clothes, thought she'd be back in a couple of days. She did not return to her home for 11 years. And the things that those people have gone through is just unbelievable. And what I find really interesting in the public and media and academic discourse about these nuclear accidents, there's very little discussion of the victims of the nuclear accidents. Anti-nuclear people pick that up and run with it, but the actual, it's a little too close to the bone, the lived experience of people's lives being destroyed by these accidents. And you just you don't read anything about that in any post-action report, any after-action report, any lessons learned. It's like those people don't even exist. And that's a continuing annoyance for me. TEPCO doesn't want to own this because it's the world's largest utility, at least it was up until the time of the accident. And they realized that if they take on moral responsibility, they also have to take on legal and economic culpability and liability. And so they've rejected all claims against them. This is ongoing. And if you look at the Minamata mercury poisoning case that happened in the 1960s, that's still in the courts. It went to the Supreme Court last year, still unresolved. This is a photograph I took in Namie, and you get a sense here of how impossible it is to decontaminate these areas. What the government will do is they'll measure down in the lowlands where they can scrape the soil off, and then every time it rains, the radiation washes back into that. So in Japan, the 3 Mile Island nuclear accident had been very influential because the reactor designs at Fukushima are similar to the ones. These were General Electric designs that were turnkey technology that were brought into Japan in the 1960s from the United States. There were engineers in the NRC that quit after the 3 Mile Island accident because they felt that the reactor designs were inherently unsafe. Now Japan is looking to restart these reactors, but all around the world, they still have those reactor designs that date back to the 1960s. That would be like running a, first generation NASA spacecraft up into the atmosphere today. But it's so inordinately expensive to build new nuclear power plants that they live with this older technology. And by the way, here at 3 Mile Island, the unit number 2 disaster that had the meltdown, they're now repurposing and restarting for artificial intelligence because it draws so much energy. So in my writing, I have an article called Mobilizing Nuclear Bias. It was in the Japan Focus. It was also a quote that I was able to find in the Freedom of Information Act documents I related that there, and that was run on the cover of Stars and Stripes around the world. Ironically, it was also run on the cover of Russia Today in the same week. But what it was a quote from the head of nuclear technology in the US Navy, Troy Mueller, who was telling Kirkland Donald and also the ambassador that they were getting measurements out on the aircraft carriers that were 10 times above normal and that would exceed a yearly dose within a 1-day period. And one thing that you can see in these FOIA documents is that it absolutely freaked the US military out because they realized that not only were they going to possibly have their staff exposed to potentially fatal radiation doses if they had to fully engage at the Daiichi site, but they also couldn't give up on Japan because Japan is such a strategic asset that no matter what happened up at those reactors, it was lead follower to get out of the way. If Japan could not sort this, the US military was going to have to sort this. And eventually, by the 18th of March, that did happen. The US and Japanese military started to take over the plant. So I'm very concerned about time, and I can elaborate on some of these issues as we get into this. But I want to make one point through this, that it is one of the great ironies of this accident that the same military that dropped nuclear bombs on Japan were also probably the leading expertise and response for the nuclear crisis, and I think helped save Japan's situation. You had people who were, truly trained, technically trained experts. You had all the assets, and what you had at the Daiichi nuclear power plant were civilian workers. You cannot force civilian workers to incur fatal doses, but you can make the military do that as part of an operation. So in the early days of the crisis, there was a question going on, was who was going to incur these lethal doses at the plant if things really went sideways. And the US military, working in close coordination with the Jieitai, the self-defense forces, eventually were able to bring it under control. But it took weeks for this to really come under control. The media turned off of the nuclear crisis within about 5 days because the Arab Spring had just started, and they focused all their coverage on Syria. But the nuclear accident was very severe for at least 6 weeks. I think much more severe than what people note. What I say to people now is that in the early days, it was much worse than what people realize. Today is probably much safer. But when you see that pink circle, that's the hot zone going over the top of Namie. That was one afternoon of one day. And another great irony is, aside from the people working at the nuclear power plant, the very first people hit by this nuclear plume were on the Ronald Reagan aircraft carrier. They were coming back from Korea doing a training mission to do tsunami relief efforts, and they were hit by that plume at about 100 miles distance. They had not expected to be close in to have the radiation doses that they were getting. And also at the same time, down at Yokosuka, the George Washington was ported, and it was getting high radiation releases that were alarming. You can see in the FOIA that the US Navy is talking about leaving Japan as early as March 12th. And eventually they did. 8,300 military dependents left Japan on an operation called Pacific Passage. And it was kind of a staged drawdown, but I learned through my interviews that, well, this is in the public domain. When Kirkland Donald and the Navy fleet got off the phone with the Pentagon and Obama, they turned to a room of other officers and said, "That's it, we're leaving Japan, start your PAGs." What's a PAG? A Protective Action Guideline. And they started burning documents, they started smashing machines, and they were preparing for a total evacuation of US military. I had a very dramatic moment where, I don't know, 3 days into it, I called a Navy attaché at the embassy who had lectured my class. And I said, "Just how bad is this?" And he said, "It's pretty bad." I said, "We got all these parents and study abroad providers calling. I don't know what to tell them. How bad is it?" Long pause, and he said, "Look, if it comes down to it, we're going to get the Americans on the top of those ships and get them out of Japan." And I found out later that a group of Marines preparing for that contingency. So it was a near thing. And I think that the legacy of this now is it safe to be running nuclear reactors in one of the most seismically active countries in the world? That is a question worthy of debate. So we should go to Q&A. We don't have a lot of time here.
Okay, great. Let's shift over to the Q&A session here. All right, awesome. Thanks, Isaac, for your help with that. So we'll start Q&A. I'll start off with a couple questions, and I want to encourage everyone in the audience. Please feel free to drop your questions into the chat, and we will add those in as well to our Q&A session. But to start us off, I've got quite a few. I guess I want to mention one thing, obviously 2024 Nobel Peace Prize winning organization was a Japanese organization, Nihon Hidankyo. It's a grassroots movement of atomic bomb survivors, also known as Hibakusha, from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Obviously, they won the Peace Prize for their efforts to achieve a world without nuclear weapons. Now, of course, nuclear weapons and nuclear power are two very different things, but I feel that any nuclear can be worrisome for many in Japan. Um, I was curious, what are your thoughts on this with them winning the Peace Prize? And do you think that the added attention this brings to nuclear issues could help to shape the discussion around nuclear in Japan and abroad moving forward?
That's a very good question. I'm cynical on this because that conversation has been happening since World War II. And, when Obama visited the Peace Park, the first president to go there, that reinvigorated the discussion. You would hope that it would have some influence, but I think that what you see with state level actors, what you see with governments, what you see with the nuclear industry, is they have such deeply rooted financial and political interests that they're rather impervious to moralistic arguments. There's a distinction in politics between what might be called aspirational liberalism and cynical realism. And military folks are realists, and the realist notion is based upon a Hobbesian notion of a war of all against all. People protect their best interest, and you do what you have to do. It's been interesting that Germany's gotten rid of all nuclear power. And France, in the meantime, has 70% of its power comes from nuclear. They're right next to each other. I spoke at the German Institute of Japanese Studies conference on Imagined Technology Futures about 6 weeks ago. And I was I was the wolf in the henhouse. I mean, they were not amused by some of the things I had to say because part of what I was emphasizing is that I think nuclear is with us. I think it's going to be very difficult. You have to have alternatives. And right now, in renewables, with wind power, solar power, it's not scalable to the point where it compensates for the level that nuclear energy does. 30% of Japan's power was run through nuclear energy prior to the accident. Now it's about 6 to 7%. And I was somewhat surprised to learn that the most expensive disaster in human history before COVID was the Tohoku triple disasters and the Fukushima nuclear crisis. Interestingly, the second most expensive disaster in world history was the Kobe earthquake because it happened in an urban area. So the economic impact is massive. And it's hard to get people to focus on moral turpitude when so much politically and financially is at stake. And one other point I would make is I think it's a false dichotomy to make a distinction between commercial nuclear energy and nuclear weapons. One without the other. They all come from the same source. And historically, they go back to the same point of origin. People who deal with military platforms or commercial platforms, they really want to make that distinction. But look at the nuclear states around the world. Japan right now has the largest stockpile of weapons-grade plutonium in the world. It doesn't have nuclear weapons because the United States have nuclear weapons. But if the United States left, if Trump decides to become totally isolationist and pull down, how many weeks do you think it'd take for Japan to get a nuclear weapon? So at the conference that I mentioned, well, let me take another question. It'll take a
Yeah,
second to pull this
that's a
slide
good
up.
point. They could obviously ramp up very quickly. I do want to mention, you mentioned the percentages of Germany and France. I had another question that I was going to ask a little bit later, and I even saw some comments as well from the audience. It makes me think of energy security. And obviously, energy security is an important issue for any nation, perhaps even more so for an island nation like Japan, that doesn't have vast natural energy reserves. Speaking of percentages, do you know what the current Japanese administration hopes to do in terms of nuclear power? So in the past, I know previous administrations were looking to have like I know Abe was looking to have around 20 or 25% coming from nuclear. But I think in 2023, just 8.5% of total electricity generation came from nuclear. Obviously, that does bring up a lot of concerns I saw in other questions talking about obviously the Japanese public's reception to this. But do you see the government being able to make any shift in these percentages moving forward? You mentioned renewables as well. I recently read articles about strong technological progress with solar cells in particular in Japan, maybe like a next generation of solar energy. But I don't know much about it. I've just been seeing the beginnings of those conversations. Where do you think Japan stands in a possibility of raising those percentages back up? Do you think it's something they need to do to meet consumer demand and energy security demands, or are they successfully navigating a new normal post disaster where they're fine
Yeah.
with 8.5%?
I think the only thing that's really going to solve the problem is if there's a value shift in which people do not demand so much energy. If we go with the current rates of energy demand, I don't see how we get rid of nuclear. So to answer that one question, this is a very recent chart. The government is trying to project up to 20% from up to 2030. The problem with Japan is that the age of some of these reactors is quite old,
Mhm.
and they can't. Some of them they can't restart. There was one that was just refused to restart because it's on a fault line, and obviously that would be problematic.
Slightly.
The worldwide, a lot of the nuclear reactors are really quite old. The United States has the oldest fleet of nuclear reactors in the world, because they had started first. But I visited 3 Mile Island, and it looked like some ancient ruins. I mean, the concrete was literally dissembling, and they're looking to restart. So in some cases, they're re-licensing plants that were built in the 1960s, and to build it, there are new designs. The AP1000 out of Westinghouse is in every possible way more sophisticated and safe. And China's using those or a version of it. But you can't get anyone to build a nuclear power plant now for two reasons, or several reasons. One is it takes about 15 years to work out the siting and regulatory process for any new nuclear reactor. Secondly, you're talking about billions of dollars. And the other problem with it is that you have to have a regulatory process that involves all levels of government, including local buy-in, and to go
I
through all these
lost you.
processes. Excuse me?
Oop. Sorry, if someone had their mic on, please I ask everyone to keep your mic muted. Apologies.
Sound
I
well.
think, what'd she say?
I don't know. I've muted. If you have any questions, anyone in the audience, I ask you please put them in the chat and we will bring them up.
Yeah, okay, so a couple of meaningful charts here. This is in Japan. We're talking about nuclear energy supply. The nuclear is in purple at the bottom, right? So it reached its peak in the early 2000s, dropped off to nothing after 2011, is climbing back.
I see.
And what you see in a lot of these countries, it's the case in Korea, it's the case in many of the Asian countries, up to 90% of their energy supplies are coming from outside their own country. I mean, this is what led Japan to war, right? So it's a long-standing structural issue.
Very good.
In an idealistic world, if people would be willing to invest in state-of-the-art technology, incur that cost with a proper regulatory structure, I think nuclear energy could be safe. The problem now is you have these ancient plants that are being relicensed, and in Japan they're on fault zones. Japan is a country that has 1/34th the area of the United States. A country the size of California had 54 nuclear reactors, more than half of those sitting on seismic fault zones. That would seem to be problematic.
Yeah, the fault lines I assume complicate Japan's nuclear power ambitions quite dramatically.
There's a scholar at Harvard named Mark Ramsar who has he's a very provocative scholar, very controversial actually, but he has a paper on nuclear power in Japan. It's entitled, "Why Do Nuclear Utilities Build Nuclear Reactors on Fault Zones?" And he says they build them on fault zones not despite the fact that they're on seismic fault zones, but because they're on seismic fault zones. because then if they have a disaster, they can write it off as an act of God and they're not legally liable for it. And that's exactly what happened in Fukushima.
Well, I'd like to say that's a pessimistic view, but it's a shame because it seems like the view is has been seen out. That's terrible to hear.
Can we take some more questions?
Yeah, let's continue on with that. I was going to mention, you mentioned the fault lines being a major issue. Obviously, another major issue is public sentiment. We had a question from Isaac Nordenberg. We actually had a few other people discussing this idea. How has public sentiment towards nuclear energy evolved in Japan since Fukushima? What efforts have been made to rebuild trust in nuclear safety amongst the people?
The statistics, this is very much conjoined to trust in government. So immediately after the crisis, trust in government officials had reached an all-time historic low. And ironically, trust in the military reached an all-time post-war high. This is on the one-year anniversary after the crisis. And they're comparing TEPCO and the Prime Minister's office as the Class A war criminals. So, there's no appetite for nuclear energy up in Japan. I asked a mayor of, I think it was Kawauchi. He had all of his staff there. There was some researchers in our audience that had met with them. I said, are you pro anti-nuclear? And he kind of laughed and looked down the line and they were all giggling. And he said, it'd be pretty hard to be a politician in Fukushima now and be pro-nuclear. But I also took from that he had been pro-nuclear. And you have this odd cognitive dissonance among these guys who had, they had grown up with those nuclear power plants. They had worked in these nuclear power plants, or people they knew did. I had an interview at one of the refugee shelters with the guy who had been evacuated. And I was asking him, this is a guy, I asked him, what do you think of TEPCO? And he kind of abashedly said, well, I am TEPCO. He had been a mid-level manager at TEPCO. His home was washed away by the tsunami. They told him not to come back for a month because, it was dangerous and all that. And, you have people who, their entire community is employed by the plant. And now, ironically, some of them are being paid to clean up their backyards after the radiation exposure. So they're being exposed to radiation even after the fact. So it's kind of a double whammy. It's quite tragic. So I think very quickly, at least the perception of Fukushima is out of sight and out of mind. That people outside of Tohoku and northeastern Japan don't really care about that issue that much. In the early surveys that were done, men were much more supportive of nuclear energy than women. Immediately after the accident, support for nuclear energy went up in England, of all places. And it's very high in France because they have such a great support of it. But technically, arguably, nuclear energy is the cleanest form of energy, unless you have a nuclear accident. I was talking to someone about this, and they said, well, we can run airplanes for years on end where there's no accidents. So doesn't that demonstrate that you can run these sophisticated technologies? And I said, well, yeah, you crash an airplane, you kill 30 people. You crash a nuclear reactor, you destroy an entire region. And if you read there's an excellent book by Timothy Higginbotham on Chernobyl called Midnight at Chernobyl. If you've seen the HBO series, it seems to be something of a reflection on that, but actually they're distinct. And Midnight at Chernobyl really gives you a sense of, as bad as it was, it could have been much worse. And the same thing is the case of Fukushima. People don't know this, but up in Fukushima, you had the Daini plant that was only 11 to 13 kilometers south of the Daiichi plant. And if they had lost the site there at Daiichi, at one point in time, the operational staff of the Daiichi plant were going to evacuate. The radiation doses would have become so high that the people at the Daini plant would have had to leave. And if that would have happened, that would have been a total of 24 reactor cores melting down. And that would have been orders of magnitude even above and beyond Fukushima, or above and beyond Chernobyl. So, yeah,
And I also think it's I mean, it's easier for us to look from outside looking in and judge the scale of these disasters or potential disasters versus, the reality of it having happened in Japan. And once something happens, it's going to be very hard to change people's mind. It's going to be very hard to regain trust in these things, no matter how many facts you can put in front of them. For the same reason, we still see to this day every few months another article about fish from the shores of Japan not being wanted to be purchased in Russia or China. And no matter how many studies that are put out that say that they're perfectly safe to eat. So I think that there's something kind of almost primal that happens once these disasters happen. And it's very hard to change opinions on this.
Yeah, but I also think that people who are not expert trained in nuclear energy don't know anything about nuclear energy. And given its origins in war and the unbelievably horrific images of nuclear war and what we've seen in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it's what Kai Erikson, in a great book after the Chernobyl accident, called a new species of trouble. And we do think about nuclear energy in ways different than we think about other issues. As a thought experiment, there's a really interesting article called The Second Domestication of Fire. And it talks about how in ancient times when they first domesticated fire, it seemed to have that kind of, surreal, almost religious notion to it. And nuclear also has that sort of complex. It's hard for us to get our mind around that yield. That the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima had about as much fissile material as a walnut. Now you have hydrogen bombs that one hydrogen bomb could contaminate the entire east coast of the United States. The Zara bomb that the Russians built that had a 100 megaton yield, the shockwave from that was measured on the second revolution around the planet. It flashed birds out of the sky at 300 miles distance. And the current hydrogen bombs that they have are 1,000 times larger than the atomic bombs in Hiroshima. But, there's no education on nuclear. No one talks about it. We know Donald Trump's favorite fast food, but we don't know shit about nuclear energy. That's bizarre, The
Yeah,
one
that's
existential
true.
threat to humanity is nuclear energy, and we don't know anything about it.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, it's both a potential existential threat, yet also a potential, you know, revolution in power that could change humanity for the benefit as well. I mean, it could go either way, right? You would think that there would be knowledge.
this is that article I mentioned. It's quite interesting. It's really thought-provoking. Anyone wants to take a snapshot of that, or
We're still seeing your slide deck.
okay, 1 second.
If you have a link, we could possibly put it, a domestication of the second fire. Isaac, I'm going to ask if you could do a quick Google up on that, see if you could find anything for that PDF online. If so, if you could share it in the chat, that would be great. Isaac will do his best to see if he can find an online resource to this.
I have a funny story to relate with this. I tried to interview people in the U.S. Embassy shortly after the disaster. They said, due to issues of diplomatic sensitivity, we cannot discuss these issues. They slammed the door. I reached out to the German embassy. I had dinner with the German ambassador, lunch with the German ambassador, met his first assistant, his second assistant, and eventually came to know their nuclear expert. What was happening at the German embassy is most of their diplomatic staff had fled. They want to come back. So over the course of the next year, they put in 6 nuclear experts to rotate through the embassy to try to convince people that it was safer than, what they thought. And I came to know Horst Miska, who had worked Chernobyl and was quite elderly at the time, but he was the chief nuclear officer in the German government, training their firefighters and things like that. And me being naive about these issues, in the first interview, I said, well, Dr. Miska, may I ask, are you pro or anti-nuclear? And he said, what an inane question from a college professor. He said, are you pro or anti-fire? I said, what do you mean? He said, if your house is on fire, you're going to leave. It could kill you. If your freezing to death in the wilderness, a fire will save your life. So answer the question, are you pro or anti-fire? And the point he was making is that all energy has pros and cons. The delta here is that the positive possibilities of nuclear energy far exceed any other power source aside from fusion. And yet it also serves as the greatest threat. But, we talk about missions to Mars. That's not being driven by a coal-driven steam engine. That's a piece of, visible material that's the size of your fingernail. So I
Some
think
of the talks about the future and space exploration, some of the most, I guess, scientifically supported concepts are things where it's essentially to simplify it. I mean, it's like shooting nuclear bombs out of the back of the spacecraft or the front of the spacecraft, to then have the energy wave of that blast be caught by giant screens, basically, to propel faster than a faster speed, not obviously up to light speed, but a faster speed. And they say that's one of the more realistic real world technologies that we could have to actually do space exploration, comparatively to our, combustible, like you said, coal fire and things like this, which obviously we can't have that much to really do feasible space travel. So I mean, it almost seems like nuclear is something humanity will have to address at some point, depending on what our goals are. But if I could pull it away just a little bit,
do we have other questions to address?
yeah, I was gonna bring up. We had a question from Nathan Horton, and to speak of alternatives for nuclear for Japan specifically, and he mentioned Japan has some of the most capable geothermal energy potential in the world. Yet in his eyes, it never gets discussed. Obviously, I know some of the issues there, but I was curious. Do you think that Nathan asked, do you think that would be a viable alternative? Is Japan's thermal reserves a possibility for Japan's energy security?
Yeah, I think it's a great possibility. The question is at what percent? With the amount of energy supply, I mean, the vast majority is still fossil fuels. And I guess the problem is it's like a tip of an iceberg. The roots of the infrastructure to deliver energy at scale take decades to build. And yeah, I mean, maybe in 37 years, thermal energy, if people entirely devoted their resources to exploiting it, would be meaningful. But right now, you kind of have something like proof of concept with nothing that has been, in an organized way, having massive resources devoted to it. Look at artificial intelligence right now. The world has turned its attention to that. Industries, governments, it's a priority. And artificial intelligence is coming online very quickly. It's been around for a long time, but now it's starting to reach a level almost to the singularity with human consciousness. So why do we still have coal and fossil fuel or, natural gas? Because we still have that supply. But as we run out of those resources, if we don't have something to replace it, there's going to be massive crisis. And because this plays out over the long term, people tend to pass it on to the next generation. Similar kind of things happening in Fukushima, where people feel like they've been pre-disaster and they're moving back onto the seashore after they've experienced that tsunami, and they're not building seawalls. I talked to the mayor of Tomioka City. They built a seawall that's 7.3 meters tall, 5 kilometers down the seashore. The Daiichi plant was hit by a tsunami that was 15 meters. And I said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Well, the people want to be able to see the ocean. And so they feel like it's a gambler's fallacy. They've been pre-disaster and they don't have to worry about it." But with regard to like small modular reactors, that's an interesting possibility. I talked to a nuclear expert about this. Actually, I talked to Jack Castro about this 2 weeks ago. And he said, right now what's happening is they're doing studies on this. And he said, if you give me $1 billion into 5 years, he said, I'll study the hell out of modular reactors, but when are you going to be able to implement these at scale? And he said that at MIT, they had done an analysis that for nuclear plants to be efficient, they have to have a 1 gigabyte output. So if you have a small modular reactor that has 1/10 of that, where are you going to site it? You have to site it on an existing facility right next to a 1 gigabyte reactor. It takes decades, years, to get site approval for anything. And so you might have a farm of them, you might have 10 of them. What are you going to do with them after they've been utilized? You can drop them in the Mariana Trench, you can bury them in the desert, but how are you going to deal with the spent fuel pool after the fact? You know, those small modular reactors are basically more or less the same size as one that are on a nuclear aircraft carrier. Well, the point I'm trying to say is that if you start looking at it a little more critically, the underlying infrastructure and the timeline to develop these alternative sources of energy are they're long, and it's also inordinately expensive to get there. I think it's important, and people need to devote more resources to that. But if they don't have immediate feedback on it, there's no political continuity in the United States. Every 4 years, things change. And so it's hard to be able to get people to focus in on that and stay with it for the amount of time that it's going to require to build that infrastructure. If you look at windmills, right? I just saw a windmill up in Fukushima. They had a blade by the side of the road, unbelievably massive. German technology have a 20-year shelf life. They barely recover their overall cost by the time if you measure out their entire life and their maintenance and their building costs. So I think nuclear energy, well, this is the slide that I showed that I think may not have been well received at the German Institute. I do believe this. This is a great quote by William Faulkner. And this is kind of how I feel about nuclear energy, that with all of its pitfalls and all its potential harmful effects, it's the most powerful form of energy we have. And I would challenge people who are skeptical about that to read a new book that's out by Richard Rhodes. Richard Rhodes has written probably the definitive studies on nuclear energy, nuclear weapons. He wrote the Pulitzer Prize winning book called The Making of the Atomic Bomb. He wrote a book called Dark Sun, The Making of the Hydrogen Bomb. And he also wrote Twilight's the Bomb. But he has a new book out entitled Energy by Richard Rhodes. And he's an eminent author. And it's very thought-provoking because he talks about the emergence of different modes or models of energy over time. And every new energy source is a challenge to existing structures and is initially rejected. And I think he puts nuclear energy within that context. Really interesting book. Any and Everything by Richard Rhodes, can't recommend it enough. And before we get out of here, I also want to recommend a couple of other things here that maybe some of your folks would not run across otherwise. One second.
Well, Dr. Cleveland is searching these out. I also want to share an article by Dr. Cleveland himself, mobilizing nuclear bias, in case, because we're about out of time for our questions and answers, and there was a few questions we weren't able to get to. So with that in mind, I'd like to encourage everyone to check out this article that Isaac just shared in the chat by our great speaker, and that could hopefully also help touch on things that maybe we didn't have time to in today's event.
And if you would like to challenge your own assumptions about the impact of nuclear energy, I can't recommend enough the work of Robert Bo Jacobs. Bo has been at Yokohama Peace Institute, Yokohama City University. He has a PhD in the history and philosophy of science. And this new book just came out through Yale University Press. But if you go online, you can see that talk that he gave to a group of my students live at Hiroshima last year. About 50 of our students were there. Talk about quieting a room. It was a little unnerving. But Bo really has the receipts, the expertise. and is a very, I think, morally grounded and serious person. I can't recommend that enough. And as maybe access into that, this webinar that was held through University of Chicago is available online. And below that is an event that I organized a few years ago on Hiroshima, the 70th anniversary of Hiroshima. That was also with Bo Jacobs. Any and Everything by Bo Jacobs. He's done work on global hibakusha, particularly in the Marshall Islands.
That's awesome. Wonderful. I'll share a link to a profile of his into the chat now.
This book also.
I just shared is Bo Jacobs. That being said, we are about out of time for today. So other than that, I'd like to say thank you to our speaker today. Thank you, Dr. Cleveland. It was lovely having you. We really appreciate this talk. Like I said, Dr. Cleveland's been wonderful for YCAPS. Hopefully we can set up another in-person tour to Fukushima. I know we did it last year, and I was lucky to be able to attend, and it was outstanding. And we had David Satterwhite along with us for that one.
Yeah.
And he was an excellent host and guide for that wonderful.
Jeff, I've been up there 9 times in the last 6 years. Every year we go, they change the message. Now, the only thing they're talking about is tritium. It's 3 hours. They can't stop talking about tritium. 4 years ago, not a word about tritium. So
it is what it is. Well, thank you everyone for joining us. That's gonna be it. Like I said, I'm just putting in some links to everything I talked about into the chat. So feel free to check those out. Other than that, that's it for us today. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you. I appreciate the invitation. And if anyone wants any recommendations on issues related to my research or, the things that I've been reading, I'd be happy to share.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Have a great day, everyone. And again, I want to mention one last time, we look forward to Amani coming back. And I want to say, Amani, good luck with your pregnancy. I hope everything goes well. I'm sure her family's in town, and I'm sure they're taking care of her nicely. All right, guys, have a great day.
Thank you. Take care, folks.
FadTech's IT support and mobile internet service helps make events like this one possible. Thank you.